morning, Warsaw. Today is Sunday, 13th of August. It will be cloudy with highs of 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 5:31 a.m. and sunset at 8:22 p.m. We are on the 13th day of the Warsaw Uprising. Today, the insurgents suffer a great loss, but we will talk about that a little later. Alina, what can you tell us about what else is happening during the uprising?
Thanks for that, Philippe. Yes, there are lots of atrocities happening, heavy bombings of the old town, and new equipment that's being used by the German military. But I think we actually are going to start with that event where people do lose a lot of lives. And Roger, what happens?
Yes, we mentioned yesterday, I think, about the advent of the Goliath, this sort of what we might call a tracked mine, a miniature tank that packed with explosives that the Germans used against barricades, particularly in Warsaw. There was a sort of a Big Daddy version of the Goliath, if you like, which was known as the Borgward, which was a sort of larger version with a much larger payload. It was about 3.5 tons in weight, and one of these was delivered or driven up to a barricade in the centre of the city. And as I said, it looks to all intents and purposes like a sort of regular tank, but in sort of miniature size. And it didn't explode or wasn't detonated at that point. The insurgents rush out and take it, and it's then taken behind the barricades and it's driven around by them thinking that it is in a sense a sort of regular tank. So they think they've gained another piece of important hardware. And during that sort of celebration, the tank's explosive charge is detonated, and in the aftermath, about 300 Poles are killed. It's not entirely clear precisely what the circumstances were, whether that was done as a ruse or if it's just the detonation was supposed to happen earlier and didn't, and was subsequently done remotely. It's not entirely clear, but the end result, unfortunately, was that 300 Poles were killed.
Well, this is not the only weapon that's being used against the insurgents. We've been discussing this over the past few days of various different types that arrived in Warsaw. And the next one on the list, which is set up on this day specifically, is the Karl mortar. It's a mobile German mortar which is designed for destroying heavy fortification positions. Now, there weren't very many of these in Warsaw at the time, so a couple are being brought into the city at this stage. And the problem with this specific weapon is that the shells don't quite explode as they're supposed to. They're supposed to be hitting fortified positions, not residential areas and soft ground. So the gun has a range of 42 kilometres. That's about 26 miles. It's a very, very, very long range, meaning that this gun could be used in one part of the city, hitting completely different other areas and other districts. It has a 600mm caliber shell, but the really good thing is that because the shells don't explode, as Claire mentioned this a few days ago, it means that the insurgents can actually recycle these bombs and use the various different explosives that they had made themselves because they're lacking in weapons and lacking in ammunition. This is such a horrible weapon, but there is a plus side to this because these bombs just don't explode and the insurgents can make use of it. So we've got an idea of what's happening on the ground, more or less. We haven't touched on what's going on in the air. Claire, what's going on there?
Well, very significant day, 13th of August, because that's when the British planes dropping weapons and ammunition really begin to have an impact. And actually, rather nicely, there's a symbolic thing as well, because with these drops, they also dropped a wreath with an inscription on it to give courage and raise the morale of the Poles on the ground. It says, "From the British soldiers to our great fighting comrades of the Polish army," which is very much read as a promise that there will be more supplies coming. So I think it was about midnight when two of the guys we've been following, Rom and Jan Novak, on the ground, they both heard the anti-aircraft fire and they saw enemy searchlights crisscrossing the sky. Novak was lying down on the roof of a former nightclub in Warsaw, actually. He's trying to get some copy for his radio broadcast, and he wants to cover the bombing, and he wants to cover the delivery of supplies. And this is what he wrote. He said, "Against the backdrop of a dark purple sky, the bombers looked like enormous black birds. And those blackbirds were actually, I think there were 20 Halifax overhead, coming with this deafening roar. And then Novak said that the dark oblong bundle spilled out from behind. Rum was also in Warsaw, making preparations for this delivery. Of course, they knew it was coming. So he was down on the ground, holding flares in one of the squares below to try and guide that delivery home so that the containers full of supplies would land to the Home Army and not go into enemy hands. And then both Rum and Jan Novak, from their different vantage points, they saw that at least one of these aircraft bore the Polish Air Force checkerboard insignia on its fuselage. So they were heartened because they knew there were Polish pilots among those who were coming over to deliver supplies. In fact, there were also pilots from Britain, Canada, and South Africa that night. And then there was a huge explosion, a sudden flash and a massive explosion. And Novak wrote, "For a split second, we could see parts of the wings and the fuselage scattering in all directions. And it was a Liberator that had been damaged by anti-aircraft fire. And unfortunately, there were six air crew inside. And only the gunner, the young Sergeant Henry Lloyd Lane, who was the only survivor of that crash." So I would say, I mean, in 1988, a monument was erected by Margaret Thatcher in Poland to honour the fallen aircrew, because these were just some of huge, I mean, the attrition rate was absolutely appalling for the numbers of aircraft that made it. And then, I mean, just flying over to drop an agent into occupied territory was incredibly high risk. But when you are expected as aircraft coming into a city in flames, heavily defended, with anti-aircraft fire, with snipers just shooting up into the sky as well from the tops of the buildings, you're flying in low. It's extraordinary that any of them made it back, and there were huge casualty numbers. I think that night, 3 different Halifax were lost, 4 limped into Russian-held territory, and even there they weren't safe because the Russians, even though we were allies, they interned the crew. And it was only when the British Embassy intervened that they were finally allowed to go back to the West. So, yeah, extraordinary night.
So we have airdrops with supplies coming in. How are the people's morale at this point? Are they happy? Are they excited? Is it something good for them?
Well, obviously, I mean, receiving supplies from the West was a huge morale boost. They knew that not only had they got new equipment immediately, but also they seemed to promise that they hadn't been forgotten, that the West was paying attention, that all of those radio broadcasts going out had been received, and the West was finally beginning to take action and support them. So there was an upturn in morale. I mean, of course, at the same time, this is a city, you imagine what it was like in the Blitz, and this is a smaller area with a higher concentration of bombing taking place. I mean, it's an incredibly difficult situation, very depressing. But because the Home Army had very wisely ordered that this should be a recorded battle, that sent these guys out, these units that we mentioned earlier, with cameras and film, but also cine film. So they were recording that, and now they decided to try and raise morale, both civilian and fighter morale, by putting on their first ever screening of footage from the Warsaw Uprising, which was shown incredibly during the battle itself. So it was shown the first time it was shown. I think they showed footage 3 times, but this was the first day that it was shown. And they took over the Palladian Cinema, which so far had managed to survive the bombardment. And it was absolutely packed to the rafters, with Home Army soldiers, with the messengers, with medical staff, with civilians from the nearby neighbouring properties, also with other members of their press that they could report that they had done this. It's an extraordinary little set piece in the middle of the Warsaw Uprising. Of course, everything doesn't stop for it. As they're playing the footage, it's silent. There's no, they weren't recording sound on this, but it's played to the backdrop of machine gun fire from battles that are going on not far away. So you got the sound of the battle behind it and footage recorded just days earlier. I mean, they actually recorded 30,000 square metres of film tape. And then they do this first screening on the 13th of August. It's just amazing.
The Warsaw Uprising Museum actually did an incredible job of a film on the Warsaw Uprising, where they combined a whole story together with all of this film footage and coloured it, added music, added background noise, added narration, added voices. And I'd highly recommend people to be able to go and see it. It's really harrowing. And yes, it does touch on the Wola massacre. So just a warning for some of the people who will be watching it.
One of my friends, Marianne Dukowski, she was interviewing a veteran from the Warsaw Uprising, a woman who she knew very well. Absolutely fantastic woman, still out there campaigning on stuff. And she showed her some of the footage, and they found her. She herself was filmed during the Warsaw Uprising, and she hadn't known it. She found herself on the footage and looked back at it from 80 years. Amazing.
I love that. I'm adamant that my grandfather is there somewhere in the footage, because Jerzy Tomaszewski, who was one of the cameramen and photographers, he was in the Powiśle district, and I have seen footage of my grandfather's platoon, and I know this very specifically, that they do exist. They are out there, not just photographs, but film footage. And I actually need to go and sit down one of these days in the Warsaw Uprising Museum and just go through it, because I'd love to be able to find something on him. I think that would just be the most amazing thing for me.
While we are on a rather lighter note, really, I know one of the wonderful things in the Warsaw Uprising is that life doesn't stop in so many ways. We still have people falling in love. And we had how many weddings? An awful lot of weddings that took place during the Warsaw Uprising. I'm going to talk about one later, but I think there's one that happened on the 13th that you know about, Alina.
Yes. So there were about 256 weddings that we have currently recorded. That's about 4 weddings a day during the uprising, but they're not quite sure because there probably were more that were just not registered within the system. So these happened all around the city, mostly in the Midtown area, but they did happen in some of the other districts as well. The problem here is that the insurgents had to get consent of the headquarters, but as you very well know, you're in the middle of a war, so many of those turned a blind eye to the formalities and they just got married anyway. So how would these weddings look? Well, they would take place sometimes, but very rarely, in a church. They would take place in bombed out homes. Anywhere in basements, anywhere where they could get married, they would get married. Wedding rings would be exchanged. Sometimes it would be things like machine gun bearings, canned food rings. So it wasn't very easy just to pop down to the jeweler and grab yourself a set of rings. They made do with what they could. Wedding parties would happen afterwards. So, for example, you could have horse steaks, wine, vodka, all sorts of things were found and dug up, especially for this extraordinary moment. However, sometimes wedding parties ended in disaster, and that's when one whole wedding party was actually killed during a bombing raid. A bomb dropped directly onto the party. So what other things would happen? Well, you'd have wedding gifts. So, for example, you could receive a clean bathtub of water or a night off, of course, so you could spend your wedding night together. You could even get some leave, soap, which was in dire need, ammo. So all various different wedding gifts were given. Sometimes a clean dress or a clean change of clothes. But this is the thing. Sometimes people didn't know how much time they had left, because you just wanted to be with the ones you love. Some didn't get married because they were afraid of leaving their spouse as a widow at such a young age, and this happened quite often, and then one spouse ended up being killed and the other not being able to recover. There's a story of one woman who said that she would wait for the love of her life as he went to war in the Warsaw Uprising, and he never came home. And forever she's still been waiting for him till the day she died. The shortest marriage was about a day. As we very well know, you can see, wedding party, that was just, I'd say, a couple of hours. Sometimes both of the people would be killed. In the example of Jerzy Zborowski and Janina Trojanowska-Zborowska, they were married on the 17th of August, and literally a month later, on the night of the 22nd, 23rd of September, they were captured by the Germans with other wounded insurgents from a basement of a tenement house. The following day, they were led out with a column of prisoners, and according to witnesses, she was last seen with her husband, and they were most likely murdered together because their bodies have never been found. Some people never made it to the altar. For example, Barbara Ranowska and her fiancé Piotr Jaszczuk. She was seriously wounded, sent to hospital, and he accidentally hastened her death because he gave her a drink that caused her extreme agony with the internal injuries that she'd already received. She died the next day, and he never recovered and died a few days later.
Weddings were hugely important for the morale of the resistors throughout the war, and it just showed that we are not defeated. We are not just surviving. We are living We are celebrating. We are marrying. You cannot keep us down.
One of the most famous weddings is actually of Bolesław and Alicja Biega. It was recorded and actually shown at the Palladium Theatre in the following session. And I have his testimony here. It's a little bit on the long side. I apologise. I just didn't want to cut it. I just think it's such a beautiful testimony. So you're all going to have to sit through and listen to it, because for me, I loved it.
My arm was wrapped in plaster of Paris with a small window over the wrist for changing dressings. Whenever Lily had a free moment, she came to visit me, at least once a day. When Lily had gone back to the post office, Frasha asked me, "I've watched the two of you for some time. You're both very much in love. Why don't you get married?" "Yes, I love Lily and she loves me," I answered. "We talked about getting married many times over the past few weeks, but it just wasn't a very practical thing to do in these difficult times. We plan to, as soon as this is all over, if we both survive." He asked, "Why don't you do it now?" "How could it be done?" I responded. "I will ask the battalion adjutant." He proceeded to write a note, which he sent with one of the couriers. Early the following afternoon, a messenger brought him the note. He read it, smiled and said, "The arrangements have been made. Your wedding will be tomorrow morning in the paper shop upstairs. I have sent a messenger to Lily to tell her." Rysia Vitali, the doctor's wife and constant assistant, made arrangements to get me a suitable uniform for the ceremony. Lily was in a state of shock when she received the unexpected message, but her friends rallied around her to help her and gave her a clean blouse and skirt. My father came by to visit me. When I told him the news, he was vehemently opposed. He said, "This is a ridiculous thing to do. You have no home, no job, no way of supporting a family." All the usual parental objections. I explained patiently, "Dad, you know that we've been in love for years. Tomorrow we might all be dead. So all the old rules don't mean anything. At least we'll be together as long as we can. Perhaps we'll survive somehow. Let's hope and pray we do. Then we'll figure things out together." He went away quite angry, but after reflecting he realized that I was right. In the morning he came to the ceremony and gave us his blessing. A field altar was set up on bales of paper in the store upstairs. The borrowed uniform was pushed and pulled onto me, the plaster on my left arm. Finally, I was ready just as Lily arrived with an honor guard composed of 6 of her girls, holding a bouquet of rather wilted gladius flowers in her hand. An attack on our positions had occurred that morning, so none of my colleagues, not even the best man, could come to the ceremony. However, the propaganda section, which was stationed in the nightclub Adria, just across the street, sent over a film unit. The entire ceremony was filmed, to the annoyance of the battalion chaplain, who disliked the bright lights and noise. Lily saw the whole film 2 days after the ceremony in the Palladium cinema. We exchanged wedding rings, not gold but brass curtain rings. After the brief ceremony, the chaplain wrote up the marriage certificate. Then all the participants and the other patients enjoyed a wedding breakfast composed of French sardines and pâté on biscuits captured from the stalls of the German garrison the post office. The obligatory toasts were made with vodka. We spent our wedding night on the floor of the antechamber to the office of the head postmaster. Our wedding bed was a mattress on the floor. We didn't have much privacy. All night long, messengers tiptoed past our bed into the suite, which was the company command post, but this did not bother us. I was in pain, so I did not feel very romantic, and we contented ourselves by cuddling together. Exhausted, we fell asleep.
Definitely one of my favourite testimonies there. Something to brighten up the day a little bit more. Thank you so much for joining us on day 13. Hopefully you'll tune in to listen to a little bit more on day 14. And remember, if you do like us and you like to help us get our ratings up a little bit, please go and give us a 5-star review on your preferred listening platform. Thank you so much, everyone.